Okay, welcome back to Inclusive Design 2022, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters Intopia and Fable, and Gold supporters Barrier Break, TPGI, and UX for the Win. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have questions for the presenters, which you should, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag or post them in the YouTube chat, which we have re-enabled this year. And we'll have Q&A at the end of the session. I am delighted to be joined by Kathleen McMahon, who's already doing a great job with co-hosting. So Kathleen, over to you.
Hello. So next we have Lydia Hooper. And Lydia Hooper will be talking about empathy is broken, moving from cognition to compassion. So over to you, Lydia.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here and appreciate all of you who are tuning in live or watching the recording afterward. I'm really excited to share about this topic with you. A lot to share, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. As Kathleen said, my name is Lydia. I'm a white-bodied female. I have short curly hair. I'm wearing very large glasses, and I have a very expressive face. So I want to start just with some gratitude. I live here on Turtle Island in the unceded territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people. And there are many teachers and communities that inform my ongoing study and practice, and therefore this presentation. So I just want to start off by expressing gratitude and really reverence to the many teachers that I have that ultimately led me here to share some insights with you today. A little bit more about me. I have an interdisciplinary background in the arts sciences as well as community engagement. My first careers were in therapeutic body work and early childhood education. I think that's really important for me to share, given the topic that I'm going to be sharing about here today, because those are the careers in which I actually began to learn some of the skills that I'm going to be talking about here today. I'm currently a UX designer working in civic tech. I'm committed to trauma-informed inclusive design practice, and I'm a devoted practitioner of nonviolent communication. If that's something you're not familiar with, then that's fine. You're in the right place. I'm going to be sharing more about that in this presentation. So today, what I'm hoping to talk to you about is why this topic is something that's important. What are the things that we need to know about empathy? What are some of the blocks or barriers to empathy? And then, of course, want to share with you some empathy practices that you can take with you today. So first, I want to talk about why this topic. In the field of design, I feel that designers are expected to be empathic. And yet, at the same time, empathy skill building is typically not something that's part of design training. So I'm really interested in trying to bring some of the skill building into the field because I strongly believe that empathy is critical if we want to design in ways that serve the needs of all people, of all backgrounds, and of all abilities. It's critical for understanding those needs, and it's also critical for addressing the needs. So I thought I would just start with some framing about empathy and design, and I've got these two quotes side by side. The first one's from IDEO's Field Guide to Human-Centered Design from 2015. Human-centered design is premised on empathy, on the idea that the people you're designing for are your roadmap to innovative solutions. Empathizing with the people is the best route to truly grasping the context and complexities of their lives. But most importantly, it keeps the people you're designing for squarely grounded in the center of your work. So what this is saying essentially is that empathy is something that is absolutely critical to human-centered design. In contrast, I have a quote from Sakai Farai, a presentation she gave at a UX research conference in 2020. And her statement is, "We rely less on empathy than we think. There's a persistent lack of self-awareness in user research today, and that lack of self-awareness, combined with the way user research is used, creates the empathy impossibility. There's an absence of empathic people, there's an absence of empathic processes, and there's an absence of empathic environments. So holding these two things together, I think, gives us a sense of both the possibilities and why we might be invested in learning more about empathy, and at the same time, a humility that we're not there yet as a field, and that we have a long way to go. So that's really where I'm hoping this presentation can step in and try to help bridge some gaps. So this is also why I'm incredibly grateful for my personal practice in nonviolent communication, otherwise known as NVC. Nonviolent communication is a practice and philosophy that was developed by Marshall Rosenberg in the 1960s, and it's now practiced all across the world. And basically what it is it's a way of communicating and relating in an interpersonal way based on empathy and compassion. And that's meant to stand in contrast with other ways that we might relate that would be based on domination or force or having power over. So nonviolent communication really centers around this idea that there are universal human needs. And what's meant by universal is just that when I'm thinking about a need I might have, I wouldn't necessarily, I might typically be thinking something like, I really need for my sister to call me so that I understand what's happening with my family right now. That's a very specific need. A universal need, if we want to use that same situation, would be something like, I have a need for understanding, or I have a need for connection. So it's a very universal idea of what those needs are. And the basic premise of nonviolent communication is that when we connect to those needs, we discover that those needs are never in conflict, that actually it's possible for all of us to have our needs met all of the time. And conflict only arises when we start to think about how we get those needs met. And the way that we are able to understand each other's needs and get to a place where we can actually understand how to meet all those needs is by relating based on empathy. And so it's this practice in nonviolent communication that is very much informing my design practice today. And it's what I want to share with you. The last piece about nonviolent communication I didn't mention, but it's very important, is that when we're sharing about experiences, they're fully contextualized. We're thinking about it in terms of our own personal experience, what's happening interpersonally, and also what's happening systemically. So there's a lot of layers to how we might be thinking about how we think about needs and how we think about meeting those needs. So now I want to talk about what is empathy. I want to start to dig in a little bit more into what we mean by that word. And I wanted to start off with just some things we are learning in science. I feel like this is just basic. There's a lot here though. I'm going to go through this fairly fast. So if you think any of this piques your interest, I absolutely encourage you to try to find out more after this presentation. But I just wanted to give kind of some basics. So the first thing is every single one of us needs empathy for survival from day one. It takes empathy for us to be able to connect to our parents and for them to meet our needs, and for our brains to fully develop. So empathy is something that we are experiencing before we even have language. Another discovery relatively recently is that in our brains, we have what's known as mirror neurons, and those actually cause our brain to mimic what we see. If I see somebody playing a game of baseball, then actually there are neurons in my brain that are going to fire as if I'm playing baseball. This is happening without any conscious awareness. This is just part of our brain's wiring. And the reason it's wired that way is that we are inherently social animals. And so having that sort of structure in our brain allows us to bond and be able to function as a social species. What's interesting is that the part of our brain that actually empathizes, if we want to say that there's a part of our brain that does that action, is also the same part of our brain that actually separates ourself from the other person. Why would that be? It's because actually what happens if we are too overwhelmed with our own emotions and our own sense of self, we can actually get a distorted perception of what we are seeing in the other person. So that ability for us to be able to separate from the other person is actually really critical to empathy being able to work at all. So these are kind of some of the core components of empathy. I want to talk a little bit more about the science of kind of why it's not as straightforward as all of that. So our cuddle hormone, oxytocin, both enhances our ability to empathize with those that we consider to be inside our group, our family, our tribe, and it also increases our aggression that we have towards people that we consider outside of our group, family, or tribe. When people's experiences of pain are reduced, so is their empathy for the pain that other people might feel in that same way. And empathy is also reduced when we have to make quick decisions, which does make sense. When you're trying to escape a jaguar or a tiger, it's really important that you be able to shut down certain functions of your brain, and empathy is one of those. So because of these things, there's a lot of ways that we show up in the world, obviously, and we're not particularly empathic. But the good news is that because our brains have neuroplasticity, they can change. And science has actually shown that when we develop empathy skills, those are skills that can actually persist over time. So they're absolutely worth investing in. And they're also worth investing in because when people feel understood, when people feel empathized with, actually their entire physiology changes. It can change even their health outcomes. So it's incredibly transformative, this experience of being empathized with. And so this is a little bit of the structure I'm going to continue to build on in this presentation. Now, the reason, the fact that we kind of have some things that are working for us and some things that might potentially be working against us in terms of our ability to use empathy consistently is partly why we have, a varying degrees to which empathy might show up. This is actually articulated by Nielsen-Norman Group. I really like this articulation of kind of different expressions that we might think of as empathy that actually aren't. The first one is pity. And that's where we just feel sorry for someone. And we still kind of have a concern just for ourselves. Then we might have sympathy. And in that instance, we might be able to feel someone. We might feel what they're feeling. But we still have concern for our own feelings or our own comfort. Now, with greater effort and understanding, we move toward empathy. And in that state, we're able to see someone and we are moved by them. So we have a concern for their feelings and needs. And this really tracks well with what a nonviolent communication teacher, Warren J. Sofer, has described as the components of empathy. And those are curiosity, humility, and care. So curiosity is fairly straightforward. I think the thing about that we might underestimate is that sometimes it takes a lot of time for us to really understand something. So it's not just that we want to understand, it's that we're willing to invest the time to build that understanding. Humility is a really important piece. It gets at kind of what I was saying about the science, the willingness to accept that there might be instances where we don't know, that there might be things that we're still yet to understand, and being able to hold space for that and have openness to finding new ways of understanding. That's really critical to empathy. And the last component of care, there's different ways you could interpret that word, but what it's meant in this instance is that you are open to being affected. It gets at what I was saying about being seen and moved by. So there's kind of an inherent vulnerability in being caring. And there's also a commitment to thinking about other people's needs. So these are the core components that comprise empathy. There are also dimensions of empathy. So these are different expressions, I think, is another way you could say of empathy. And this is really what I think is so critical for us to think about when it comes to how we are thinking about empathy in the field of design. Because usually we're thinking about cognitive empathy. That's where we're taking another person's perspective. We're trying to understand intellectually how they might feel. But that alone can actually be used to manipulate or even harm people. That alone is not genuine empathy. Genuine empathy also encompasses emotional empathy. That's where we're feeling along with the other person. We're experiencing what it's like to be in their life and the feelings that they have. And also somatic empathy. And that's where we're feeling it actually in an embodied way. We're actually feeling that in a visceral way. And these three dimensions of empathy combined is actually what facilitates things like healing and transformation that I was referring to earlier. So in nonviolent communication, there's absolutely a belief that empathy is something that is innate. It's something that we all have. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always present. And then in fact, we need to be able to continue to pour fuel into that fire for it to continue to be something alive in us. And I think that's really captured by this nonviolent communication teacher, Mickey Koshton. This is the quote from her. To say, as I believe, that we are hardwired for mutual recognition and empathy does not necessarily mean that we will always act in caring, compassionate ways. Rather, it means that to the extent that we ignore care and empathy and cultivate other emotional postures, we pay enormous prices. Depression, apathy, nightmares, victimization, and anger on an individual level, and crime, neglect, and isolation on a societal level. So what Mickey's really talking about here is the fact that empathy isn't something that we necessarily always want to have just for the sake of others too. It's something that actually is core to who we are as human beings. And when this is something that we're not attuned to, it can be something that costs us. And I think that's actually really interesting and important for us to think about as we think about why we might try to build these skills and what we hope to get out of that skill building. So I want to talk some more about the blocks to empathy. I've kind of alluded to some things, but I really want to dive a little bit deeper into what keeps us from having that empathy all the time. And there's actually quite a bit here. Empathy, again, is an innate capacity, but a variety of environmental factors and the way that we are socialized play a huge role in the degree to which we're actually able to be empathic, both in terms of the degree to which we have that skill, but also in the moment, how we're able to show up and be empathic in the moment. So the first couple ones are pretty obvious, and that would be what would be described as in nonviolent communication as unmet needs. And then I would say also strong emotions. If we're feeling really strained, tired, stressed, if we're feeling very emotionally activated, these are things that put the focus very much on ourselves and take us out of being able to necessarily connect to other people. Sometimes if we're in real duress, we're unable to even connect to ourselves. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that as I move forward in this presentation. The other pieces that I think are really important are what the researchers Tversky and Kahneman have described as cognitive bias, and it's also known as automatic thinking. So we've developed a variety of different mental shortcuts that help us, navigate this complex world that we live in a more easy way. And the trade-off of having those biases is that sometimes we have huge blind spots. Some of the biases that I think are most relevant to empathy are confirmation bias, conservatism bias, consensus bias, and in-group bias. I'm not going to go into what all of those are. I would encourage you to research those if you have interest in that. The basic thing that you need to understand is that sometimes the way we automatically think precludes us from being empathic towards others. A very big thing, though, that we can definitely do a lot about is the learned or conditioned habits that we have. And that might include judging, labeling, blaming, lecturing, directing, questioning, reassuring, or agreeing. Now, these are things that we have all learned to do, and sometimes they are appropriate. However, when they become just kind of something that we're habitually doing without thinking, that can actually create a barrier from us being able to empathize and express that genuine empathy in the moment. Some other pieces I want to touch on here that are barriers to empathy. Structural power and social privilege can actually lead to reduced empathy. If you're interested in learning more about that, I would encourage you to look into the work of Dacher Keltner and his book, The Power Paradox, is also mentioned in the book Inclusion on Purpose. And then I would say what I describe as protective factors are also potentially barriers. And I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but essentially, if we are overwhelmed by what we are feeling into, Sometimes we would simply shut down out of way of protecting ourselves. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. I think a lot of people in the design profession are maybe at least interested in being more empathic. I don't know if it's a natural thing, but like more than it would be for a normal person, whatever normal is. But I do think a lot of people that are in the profession are able to express empathy. And so I think it's really important that we talk about what happens when empathy is actually a liability. When we get really overwhelmed or we're over-identified with the suffering of another, that's known as empathic pain. And when we have empathic distress, sometimes that can lead to burnout. It can lead to depersonalization and it can lead to withdrawal. And the worst case scenario is we develop empathy or compassion fatigue. And that's where we are distancing ourselves from others unconsciously. We might actually become obsessed with something. We might feel exhausted. We might feel numb. There's a number of different ways that this can express. This is also known as secondary or vicarious trauma. So there are some ways that actually our body and our being is trying to protect us from the overwhelm. And so it's really important that as we think about growing these empathy skills for others, we're also thinking about how we're caring for ourselves. Which brings us directly into what I want to share with you around empathy practices. It's really important that we have both self-empathy and what I'm calling empathic presence, and that would be presence that we have with other people. This is actually backed up by research. Dr. Kristen Neff has done a lot of research on self-compassion, is what she calls it. And her research has shown that actually what happens when you have a lot of self-compassion is it creates kind of a buffer between your own experience and what others might be experiencing. And so it keeps you from experiencing some of that empathic pain that I was just talking about. Her research has also shown that self-empathy can help foster a growth mindset, which of course is so important to a design practice. In nonviolent communication, we talk about capacity. We talk about the ability for us to empathize and the degree to which we're able to do that. And I think that's very connected to the growth mindset. And how we increase that capacity is we focus on self-empathy practices. And as we're able to focus on those practices, I believe that we build what Sakai Farai referred to as empathic endurance. It prepares us to be able to be in a profession where we're expected to be empathic a lot of the time. And that is absolutely critical for us to, again, avoid some of the things I was just talking about in terms of burnout and other pieces we might experience as part of our professional life. Our ability to be able to experience self-empathy is what helps us show up and have empathic presence. I talk about it as empathic presence because I really want to think about it as something that is not necessarily about what I'm doing so much as it's about how I'm being, right? It's a very different thing. I feel like in design, we can get very focused on action, which is great, and different tools we might use. And I think empathic presence kind of reorients us around how are we actually thinking about how we're showing up, because that's so much of what empathy is. So first, I want to dive into some practices in self-empathy. I've talked about somatic empathy. I really think it's important that we're noticing any sensations we have in our body and potentially lack of, right? Because that's when we start to get those clues that we might be moving into empathic distress. And really, to be able to do that, we need to be able to pause and slow down. Remember, urgency decreases empathy. So actually that if we're constantly on and constantly going fast, that actually precludes us from being able to slow down and be empathic, including with ourselves. And sometimes we need to resource ourselves, and that can look a number of different ways. You know, maybe we're going outside and we're observing nature, or we're engaging in painting, or we're, you know, taking deep breaths. Like there's all kinds of different ways that we can resource ourselves. And I think another way that we can practice self-empathy is to receive empathy from another person. The tricky thing about this is that because there's so many misnomers about empathy, I think sometimes, and we know because we saw that spectrum, like there's a different ways that it can show up. People might think that empathy is happening and it might not be. So I think a lot of self-empathy in this regard is tuning into our own experience and being able to connect to ourselves and think about what is our experience of when someone might be empathic towards us, and start to become mindful of that skill in other people. And what happens when we start to do that is, of course, we also learn about how we can be more skillful in our use of empathy. So I want to pause here and do just a little bit of a nonviolent communication exercise. I do not anticipate that you are going to leave this session today and have a robust understanding of nonviolent communication. But I do want to absolutely leave you with a little bit of a taste of what it looks like to put this into action. So I want you to take a minute right now and check in with yourself. And see if you can note one feeling that you're having right now. I'm saying one because we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. See what comes up for you. You might notice that there are words that come up that might not actually be feeling words. A feeling word would be something, I don't expect that you can read this, the tiny print on this feelings wheel, but there are some words on this wheel. A true feeling word is something like sad, angry, excited, hopeful, confused, depressed. There's all the different kinds of things that show up there. Sometimes, though, when we're thinking about how we're feeling, we're actually using evaluative words. And I'm going to give you an example of that. Let's say for a minute, the words that are coming up for me is I feel ignored or I feel unappreciated. Those are not actually feeling words, but they're important for us to notice, because we're now going to pivot. Hopefully you have at least one feeling word. And we're going to start to think about the needs that are underneath those feelings. And again, we're going to keep this simple. So you picked one feeling, maybe think about a need that feeling might be connected to. And a universal need is what we're going for here. So it would not be something like, let's use the same example of what I was just saying. Let's say the evaluative words that you were using were ignored and unappreciated. Now, you might think what I need is for my boss to come to me and tell me I did a great job today. That's not a universal need. Actually, what you would be looking at with a universal need would be something like acknowledgement or appreciation or to be seen or understanding. It's very big picture needs that we're looking for here. And sometimes those evaluative words can actually help us better identify what that need might be. So that's why it's important to note what those words might be. And then once we're able to connect with that need, I'm going to pause here in case you need a moment. I'd like you to consider a request you might make for yourself to meet that need. So again, let's say my need was acknowledgement, which is what I just said for this example. I might simply make some notes to myself about how I think I did a good job today. That's a way that I can start to meet that need for myself. You might not have time to complete this exercise right here and now, and this might be something that you choose to continue to do after this presentation. But I wanted to give you just a little taste of what this self-empathy practice can look like through a nonviolent communication lens. And now I'm going to talk about how that kind of practice can inform what you might be doing as a designer. So here is a different take on empathy mapping. Sometimes we do this in design, and usually when we're doing it, we're focusing solely on the user. We're thinking about their feelings, their needs, their problems. I think if we can start to map out how we're feeling next to how they're feeling, these are numbered. I'm going to start with my feelings, then my needs, then their feelings, then their needs. This is a way for us to start to pay attention to how our own feelings and needs are actually informing our practice and how we're showing up. And potentially it can also be, again, a way of us noticing how we're being impacted by whatever we're hearing from that other person. And if we have a need for self-empathy, or receive empathy from someone else, that we're able to recognize that sooner. So I think this is a great way that we can start to translate this directly into our design practice. Now I want to talk a little bit more about what it means for us to practice empathic presence. being able to acknowledge those things that we're experiencing, like I was just talking about with the empathy map, is really important if we are going to be able to show up and practice empathic presence. We are connected to ourselves when we are able to connect to another person. And that connection is really what's important. That's the intention that we are seeking to have in nonviolent communication. It's very different than, wanting to be right or wanting to solve a problem. That's often our orientation in design, wanting to solve a problem. And empathic presence is actually not about that. When we express care, we're actually allowing for the feelings to be as they are. And oftentimes, I think when people think about expressing care, they're thinking more about, how can I express sympathy? Like, how can I kind of tell you, oh, I'm really sorry that you're going through that. And they're either, not going to carry that information forward and have it impact anything, or, they might even be jumping to the solution too quickly. I do think it's important to express impact if that's appropriate in the moment, and you're only going to know that if you're truly connected. And so what that can look like is kind of just sharing how it is that you are moved by what someone shares. The only other thing I want to make sure that I'm noting here verbally, there's a lot on this slide, is that when we are listening to someone with empathic presence, we are listening reflectively. And to me, that doesn't just mean that I am telling them what I'm hearing. It also means that I'm checking in with them to see if what I'm hearing is actually correct with their experience. And that's not just about me kind of correcting for my understanding. That's also about giving them the space to further explore the question. So it sounds like you're feeling unacknowledged right now. Is that right? And then someone can kind of check in with themselves and say, is that right? And there might be more there that they want to touch into. So these are some basics of practicing empathic presence. I want to go a little bit more into what I was saying, because I think this is so important in the design field for us to think about how exactly is empathy playing a role in design, particularly if we're thinking empathy is not about us coming up with a solution. So I like the way that Oren J. Sofer is describing this. He's a nonviolent communication teacher, and he says, at its core, empathy seeks to know experience directly on its own terms without trying to fix it, change it, or explain it. This willingness to be with experience is the key to empathy. When we try to fix, change, or resolve another's pain, believing that we even could, we contribute to their fear and helplessness, effectively saying, you can't figure this out, so let me do it for you. In contrast, the empathic response allows experience to be just as it is. The acceptance, trust, and genuine care of empathy impart a sense of empowerment and often a healing power. To me, this statement really circles back to what I was saying earlier about how one of the critical components to empathy is humility. That ability for us to say, you know what, maybe I don't know the solution here. I'm just going to sit here and listen to you and be present with you through your process. Now, I'm not trying to say that, design should not set out to do anything different. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is when we're in a moment where we are having a conversation with a user or someone else for whom it's appropriate to have empathy, in that moment, we're tuned into what their experience is. We can still take what we've learned in that moment and figure out what we want to do with that in terms of the changes we want to make. And that would be the care component of empathy. So I think both of these things can happen, but separating the two, I think, is really important. And I want to talk about why it would be important for us to slow down and how this might actually play out in terms of a way we could practice this in design. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I do want to make sure we have time for questions. But what I am proposing here is called a needs profile. And basically, that's a way for us to think about using this idea of universal human needs that comes from nonviolent communication and thinking about how can we start to really understand where needs are lying at the personal level, at the relational level, and at the systemic level. And it's really hard to get all of that information if we're not fully tapped in and trying to connect to that person. And what I'm proposing here is that instead of having a persona, a way that we're describing an identity, that us actually focusing on just naming these needs at these various levels is really important for us to be able to try to get to that place where we're expressing that care and we are being moved by what we're hearing. The reason systemic needs is in here, I feel like that is maybe not as obvious, unfortunately, is that systemic factors very much determine the degree to which needs are or are not met. And I do think that even though we can listen for that in a conversation, it's important that we maybe think about whether we want to gather some of that information in a conversation. I think a lot of that information is available in research, and we can definitely find ways of figuring out what those needs might be without necessarily asking for that information. But again, so much of this is contextual and based on what's actually happening in the moment in that conversation. And I do not expect that you would leave this presentation and take these various ideas that I'm offering and implement them right away. What I am trying to offer here is some ideas and some inspiration for why it might make sense for us to start to use some of these tools from nonviolent communication in our design practice. And I'll tell you, I've been practicing NVC for several years now, and my practice just continues to grow and grow. And so I do think that these would be ideas you could come back to later if you choose to continue study and think about how you might be able to better understand how to use NVC practice in your life. I wanted to offer just a few more ideas specifically for designers and researchers before I conclude here. I think it's really important that we're planning for the time that it takes to connect. I mentioned earlier about how urgency can actually decrease empathy. And the reality is it just does take time for us to start to really connect to somebody. What I see a lot in our profession is people, coming up with a nice script and kind of just going through that script and, making sure that you're doing it within a time period. I do understand the constraints. And I think that when we are thinking about what's important, maybe we do need to consider whether or not we are offering space for true empathy to happen with that kind of scenario already at play. I think, nonviolent communication is very much from a place of responding in the moment. And so I'm not saying, don't use a script at all, but I think being particularly wary of where we are asking people to make jumps in time. So tell me about a time when, or what do you think you would do if, I think that takes people out of the moment and out of connection with themselves. I think instead we can just ask simple questions like, can you say more about that? And a lot can actually come out of us just saying simple things like that. The last thing I definitely want to make sure I mention is that empathy is something that's really important for collaboration. I feel like so often we're centered around making sure that we're empathizing with our users, but we can also empathize with our collaborators, and we can empathize with decision makers, executives, our bosses. And I think that that is especially critical for conversations about inclusive design. We are asking people often to step outside of what is status quo, and that is a journey for people to go through. So to be able to offer empathy and bring that to the table during those conversations is a huge game changer. One more piece I want to mention here, that's another way of thinking about how this can apply to the design practices that we already have. So circling back to what I was saying about how systemic factors absolutely determine the degree to which our needs are met, the nonviolent communication teacher, Roxy Manning, has articulated very well that it would be important that we would prioritize the needs that have gone unmet the longest, and we would prioritize care for those whose unmet needs have resulted in or might result in significant harm. So I'm curious if we were to use this as part of our prioritization matrix, our opportunity to meet unmet needs and a need for care or reduction of harm, and how that might actually help us better prioritize the needs that we're trying to address. This could be something that we do before we do a more traditional impact effort matrix. And I'm offering this again as an example of how like empathy can be part of the experience that we have of coming back together with our colleagues and trying to translate some of what we heard in our user research into actual action, right? We're expressing that care, we're bringing in that care component of empathy as we move what we've heard forward. So I want to leave you with this question. What if you knew you can never master empathy? And that it really is the most important skill to develop. I hope that's something that will continue to sit with you. And I thank you again for joining me. If you choose to share these ideas, that would be great. I would just request that you would give proper attribution to me and to those that I cited. And with that, I am very much looking forward to hearing the questions.
Thank you, Lydia. That was a great talk. I really appreciate it. Kathleen, I think we have some, I feel like there was a cavalcade of questions, so I'm going to let you manage that.
There may be a few. I was scanning the comments in the YouTube. There was questions, there were comments, there was a lot of love being thrown your way in the YouTube comments and in Twitter, and I was trying to gather and organize. So I'm gonna run down the list.
That's fine.
Try to keep us on time. So first, I'm going to go through first just the questions first, and then we'll see how many we can throw in.
Okay,
so
sounds
the first
good.
question, the person is, there's a lot of thank yous, there's a lot of love. A person named A in YouTube asked, as developers, how can we make sure that assistive technology, AT, which I'm assuming is assistive technology, users aren't feeling like they're being held hostage by our compassion? And it's a quote from one of their friends. And it's specifically in empowerment versus charity. So,
okay, I'm going to probably have to make some assumptions about that question. What I was really caught by was that phrase of held hostage. I think this really speaks to what I was saying about empathic presence. We can think we're doing empathy, but if somebody thinks we're holding them hostage, we're probably not in empathic presence. I think that's a pretty good red flag that we're not actually, they should not feel that way. Empathic presence would be, you don't feel that way, right? It would be, I'm here, I'm holding space for you. I'm allowing you to be the human that you are. Wow, that's a really provocative question and one I might need to continue to sit with, honestly.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a heavy hitter. So we're going to lead in strongly with that. The second question, which is already answered, but I'm going to ask it again. Will the slides be available for sessions? So people are asking for slides. The official answer was the conference organizers will not be sharing them from our website, but presenters are, of course, welcome to share their slides from their preferred place or platform. But so everyone wants to know, will you be sharing your slides after?
Yeah, I think I should, because there's so many great sources on there and I want to make sure people have that. I mean, wonderful. Theoretically, they can watch the video though, right?
Of course. Of
okay.
Course. Yes.
Yes.
But however, with the video, if anyone, it's embedded images on a screen.
Yes.
That's accessible. Yes. So in
I
that way,
can share that. Yeah, I can share that on my website. If you go on my website under speaking, I'll put it there so that it's easy for folks to find.
Wonderful. Okay. I'm gonna scroll us down as fast as I can, and then I can get to the comments afterwards. I'll give you some more accolades. Okay. So here is another one from Kelsey Hall. And they asked it in two places, so I'm going to ask the one that they asked on Twitter, because they added a little extra in Twitter. How has the saturation of social media which is younger and younger impact, social media, which is like skewing younger and younger. How has that impacted society's ability to be empathetic? How do we
Well,
navigate social media's self-obsessed, air quotes, culture with thinking about others' experience? What is the connection to theory of mind?
I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that question, but I'll take a stab. There is some research that actually shows technology reduces empathy. I haven't had a chance to look into it, but I know it's out there. My sense is that the overwhelm piece is a big part of that. What I was talking about with protective factors, I think it helps us widen, right, our idea of what's happening. I think that's potentially an asset, but I think the overwhelm can shut us down. So that's my gut hunch on this. And I do think there's some research being done, but I am not entirely up to speed. So I'm probably not the person to ask this to. However, if that person wants to reach out to me via email, I'm happy to see what I can dig up in my networks.
Okay, so that is Kelsey Hall. And so they tweeted to you, and so you can respond to them on Twitter.
Great.
And they also commented on YouTube, so you can see them in both channels. And so it looks like we have 2 more official questions, or maybe 3. Let me see. There is one on Twitter, Grunette. Make sure there's no one else that I can see right now. So Grunette asked, are there certain professions where folks are taught implicitly or otherwise to do self-empathy well? Like if you're a medical professional or something.
I think that's a great question. I do know that a lot of the research that's being done about self-empathy is actually happening in the field of medicine and health. It's a lot of folks, which understandably, right, especially now that we're moving through this pandemic and we've seen how all these first responders and healthcare workers are really impacted, right? It's really how can we support people who are in those professions and being able to have the skills to have that, I was referring to as empathic endurance, right? So I think there's quite a bit of research that's happening in that field. Off the top of my head, I mean, what's interesting is they're having to teach those professionals because they don't know. It's not part of their training, just like it's not part of design training. So I think there's a lot of professions in which you're expected to be empathic. I can draw from my own experience as an educator and say that was not part of, that's not part of necessarily what you're learning. I would guess maybe in social work, it might be more the case because you have folks that you are, checking in with in your journey. And so that person is potentially, hopefully helping you and receiving and helping you receive empathy. What was the other one that just came to mind? Oh, my other profession in therapeutic body work. I do think there was quite a bit of my training in that. And I think with body work, it's really critical because it's so easy to tip over into taking on other people's energy when you are that close and intimate to them. So in that profession, I did feel that this was something that was talked about. How can you care for yourself? But I think that there's a lot of empathic professions where it's not, unfortunately.
Okay, so we have literally probably like 30 seconds to answer the last one, if we could be quick. Otherwise, we're going to have to be done. The last question is, do you have any resources about how these concepts can apply to those who are not neurotypical?
Yes.
To experience empathy. And if so, there is a tweet out there for you to respond to.
Off the top of my head, no. And I just want to say before the time closes out, these were all such awesome questions. Thank you so much for sending them in. And I received that with the same amount of gratitude as I do all of the appreciation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. This is the part where I step in. And to our loyal viewers, if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button. It's big and shiny, I'm told. And don't forget, you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop on our future events. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community. You can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design is brought to you with thanks to our supporters, Intopia, Fable, Barrier Break, TPGI, UX for the Win, Equal Entry, Infoaxia, Intuit, Law Office of Laney Feingold, Adrian Roselli LLC, and Web Able. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session. We will see you then. Cheers.